most of the people are oh, okay. So I will introduce Mike, although most of the people for sure they either they have collaborated with him or they know him anyway. I'm very pleased to introduce you, Mike, since your work for me has been very, very enlightening overall. Anyway, Michael Hoffman is an associate professor in Japan at the Wildlife Research Center of Kyoto University. And he started his career in primatology in 1979, working with Japanese macaques, with wild Japanese macaque, on behavioral ecology at the University of Kyoto. And this work for sure became a basis for his later work, still at Kyoto University. And he also studied, apart from free-ranging and captive Japanese macaques, he studied for 45 years. He has also intensively studied the behavioral ecology of wild chimpanzees in Tanzania and in Uganda, with a focus on primate host parasite ecology, primate self-medication, and ethnopharmacology. So since 2006, he has been conducting fieldwork in Sri Lanka, Taiwan, India, and Vietnam, and with collaboration in over 35 countries. So together with his students and his many collaborators, Michael has published extensively in the field of cultural primatology, animal self-medication, reproductive behavior and physiology, and many other fields anyway. And he has been very productive in publishing, including 10 books, 240 articles, book chapter, reviews, and other type of publication. His research has involved approximately 15 free-ranging and captive primate species, from apes to lemurs, and as well as other mammals in as I said before, in many countries like Japan, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, India, Vietnam, Tanzania, Uganda, South Africa, Brazil, and also Italy. For sure, he's very keen and committed in building new collaborations. And for my personal experience, I mean, I know that he's extremely pleasant to work with him. So I invite you to, have in contact with him for any kind of collaborations. So please, Mike, here the stage is for you.
Thank you, Claudia. Who was that guy you just introduced? That's awful embarrassing to hear all of that coming, but thank you so much for the kind introduction. So I guess I can go back and share the screen. As you're all aware of, I'm going to talk today about the evolution of animal self-medication, a topic near and dear to my heart, and one that I've collaborated with a couple times now, and I'll present some of that work today with many of my friends in Italy who are listening in, and some who are not, but who are always close to my heart and in my thoughts. So let me see if this works. Okay, am I up on the screen now? Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for listening in. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk to you, although the distance is further away from you all than I would like it to be. Hopefully sooner than later, I'll be back in Italy with Pippi, and we can all sit around a table with a glass of wine and good food and have some nice conversation. Okay, just let's get started. First of all, on the screen, you'll see some of my teachers in the study of animal self-medication. When I started out in this field quite serendipitously, there were very, very few people who were doing anything with animal self-medication. So we really kind of had to start from scratch. But over the years, it's really built up into quite a big discipline. And I'll try and give you a brief overview of some of that within the time that we have to talk today. So first of all, we have to get to the source. Self-medication involves the use of plants and insects, a number of different things for their secondary compounds, as well as sometimes their physical properties. So we have to start any discussion about animal self-medication with the plants themselves that produce many of the compounds that are used by animals as medicine. And plants have an anti-herbivory strategy to protect themselves from predators and disease. And those are the production of secondary metabolites and physical barriers. Both of these mechanisms try and inhibit herbivores from overbrowsing on the plant. So they try and keep them away with bad tasting plant parts that are most vulnerable, like leaves that they need for the production for photosynthesis, or also physical barriers that can be on the stems and the leaves that keep smaller herbivores away, but also even large herbivores. If they're trying to munch into a leaf with these hairs on the surface, they're made of silica and they're very difficult to digest. So it induces indigestion, and it deters animals from eating them. But as we'll see in today's talk, a number of different species use these exact same strategies for themselves to protect themselves against different predators, large and small, the small ones being bacteria, the different kinds of pathogens and parasites. So far, the earliest examples we have of self-medication come from the insect world. It probably starts in the ocean, but we really don't know a lot about life in the ocean as it relates to self-medication. That's one of the next frontiers, I think, for the study of animal self-medication. But what we know from terrestrial observations of insects and their relationships with plants, they have a very close, tight symbiotic relationship where insects are dependent on secondary metabolites produced by plants, not only to protect themselves, to make themselves taste bad, but also they use plant pheromones and are dependent on those pheromones as chemical signals to attract mates of their own species. So without for some insects, if that plant weren't around, they would not be able to reproduce. But there are a lot of uses by the insects for these compounds that actually attack parasites that have parasitized themselves. So that's really where we started in this area. But interestingly, these first studies didn't really look at this interaction as a form of self-medication. They looked at it at a different level as a chemical, as the chemical ecology of relationships between insects and plants. And it's only quite recently that self-medication in the insect world has attracted much attention. One question I'm always asked, well, which species self-medicates? Which is the most is it because they're really smart, or what? They all seem to accept that chimpanzees. They all seem to accept that chimpanzees can self-medicate. But examples. No,
sorry,
no
Mike.
problem.
Sorry, please. Could you switch off your microphone? Thank you very much. Sorry, Mike.
No problem. No problem. So I'm often asked, well, how many species self-medicate? And the simplest answer is every living species on the planet. And I wrote this little piece here on the screen today for the first time. I've often explained in similar words, but from what we know to date, there's so many different examples of plants producing deterrents that animals are actually using for their benefit, for the same function. So I think for every plant or animal in the sea or on the land that produces these compounds to repel predators, we'll surely find an animal that uses that substance for their own benefits as medicine. And I say that with confidence because every living organism falls prey to sickness or imbalances in health for different reasons. So I think it's logical that we assume that every organism has evolved some form of self-medication applicable to such threats that they face in their habits. It's as simple as that. I think it's taken a while, I think, for for science to recognize this fact, but I think traditional people, and I'll talk about this at the end of the talk, have always understood that animals use plants as medicine, and that's where in our earlier history, most of the medicines that we used came from watching the behavior of other animals. And here I give a couple different examples. If you look at the pictures that are attached and not separated by the black background, these are very interesting relationships. The one up on top, the orange and the black caterpillar, that's a woolly bear caterpillar. When it's infected by parasites, it'll consume poisonous hemlock. There's a genetic change that happens when they're parasitized that changes their preference from their normal food to hemlock, and they're able to pass this through their systems rapidly enough that it has little to no effect on themselves, but it suppresses the development or actually kills the parasites that are inside of them injected by a parasitoid wasp. The tobacco worm and tobacco leaves, and a recent study looking at sparrows that use the filters from cigarettes using the same nicotine, which is a very potent anti-parasitic agent in tobacco. These are used by completely different animals that have or have not any relationship with tobacco, but they recognize the capability of nicotine to control parasite loads. And you can kind of pick out some of the other examples in here, and I'll talk about them later on in the talk. But there's the world is full of these kinds of interesting relationships. So what is animal self-medication? Again, this is something that I've put together from thinking about this for many years, but it's a behavioral strategy basically by which animals avoid or suppress disease transmission. They can treat or control disease or its symptoms, and this directly or indirectly enhances health and, most importantly, reproductive fitness. That's why these behaviors are so embedded within all the different species that we look at. I started at this, as I mentioned earlier, very serendipitously, but over time, my goals for looking at this have kind of expanded a little bit. And I'm really interested in understanding the potential health threats to animals in nature and how an animal responds to these threats and how effectively are these behaviors maintained within a population. So that's involved studies in captivity, looking at potential social transmission of these behaviors, as well as areas where only innate response can be responsible. And in fact, there seems to be a balance between instinct and social learning. A number of the studies on this have been done, not just in self-medication, but looking at other behaviors that I've observed in Japanese macaques, for example. So in the end, what I'm trying to do is to elucidate the variability and similarity in these strategies across the animal kingdom to gain insights into the evolution of this highly adaptive set of behaviors. In science, the study of animal self-medication started with chimpanzees back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the first example was a report on leaf swallowing, or finding the presence of whole leaves in the feces of chimpanzees at Gombe and Mahale. And I'll talk a little bit about the function of this behavior later on as well. And then that was followed up in 1989 by a paper describing bitter pith chewing in chimpanzees at Mahale, which I did. And that really set the stage and was the beginning of the outlining of a set of protocol for what we need to demonstrate to show that a behavior is indeed self-medicative or not. So around the late 1980s is when this field of science really started to take off, and the direction that people began to take seemed to converge. It's a multiple disciplinary type of research. It involves extensive work in the field, but also needs a close collaboration with people in the laboratory. A number of different skill sets that one person rarely has. So that's why it's really necessary to do collaborative work with this topic. It involves behavioral observations, collection of ecological variables, talking with traditional healers, looking into the field of ethnomedicine, and a lot of non-invasive biological sampling, collection of urine, feces, hair samples sometimes, perhaps to look at different levels of stress. And you take this into the lab and do phytochemistry, parasitology, and pharmacokinetics to actually look at the action behind the chemicals that are thought to be responsible for changes in the health of animals after they self-medicate using a number of different plants or insects. So let me first outline what I think are the 4 different modes that we currently know about of self-medication, and then I'll continue the talk giving examples of these different modes as we progress through the list. Mode 1 is simply the optimal avoidance or reduction of the possibility for disease transmission. That means avoiding food or water contaminated by feces, not staying too long in a habitat where you've been and have been defecating and making dirty. But sometimes that's not possible. If you live in a nest or if you live in a burrow for a long time and you're raising offspring, then that involves another type of self-medication. That's mode 4, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Mode 2 is passive prevention. It's like a prophylactic dietary supplement. I say passive because I think it's difficult for animals to predict or to prophylactically display behaviors in response to something that hasn't happened yet. But it's basically the selection of items in the diet that aren't necessarily high in nutritional value, but aren't lacking nutritional value, but have also these bioactive properties that could be potentially very significant in suppressing the infection from bacteria or parasites themselves. And these items are eaten routinely during certain times of the year, but on a small, limited basis. Mode 3 is therapeutic treatment, and that's what you and I think of when we have a headache. We take an aspirin to relieve the fever or the inflammation. That's the direct response to a specific symptom that results in the alleviation of that discomfort. And mode 4, as I alluded to earlier, fumigation. It's the application of a pharmacologically active substance on the body or within a living space. It's not the ingestion of a plant. So we can't confuse any possible nutritional value with this. It's actually putting things where we live to keep it bacteria free or is low in bacteria levels as possible. It's also used as an insect repellent, especially insects that can transmit different types of infectious diseases like mosquitoes that transmit malaria or dengue. Okay, now for some examples for mode 2, medicinal foods, passive prevention. This is a favorite saying in Japanese of mine, Isshoku dogen. It means that medicine and food are of the same origin, and all of the items displayed in this photo here in the middle are what we consider to be spices. There's ginger, bay leaf, cinnamon, cardamom, black pepper, onions, garlic, chilies. All of these things, while we think of them as spices that liven up the taste of things that we eat, they also have a very significant antibacterial property or an immune boosting property like in ginger. But all of these things are frequently used to a higher extent in warmer tropical areas where bacterial spoilage of the food is an ever-present concern. They also have properties that help suppress parasite infections as well. Now I'll give you some examples of this. The first example that I came up with when I created the term medicinal foods, I actually borrowed the term from anthropologists studying diet in traditional living people. But what I did was to look at the diet of the Mahale M group of chimpanzees that I was studying at the time when I first started to look at animal self-medication. And I found that 22% of the species, the plant parts of the species that they ingest, are known ethno-medicinal treatments for parasite infection or gastrointestinal upsets that could be related to that. Now, chimpanzees are omnivores, but they spend a lot of time eating fruit. And if you look at the plant items within this list in the pie graph that have anti-parasitic properties, fruits actually represent a very, very small part of that. So you have an idea here that it's not their main food. Even if it's a fruit, it's something that is very minor within that portion of their diet. The majority of items of medicinal food value are leaves and stems. And I took this paradigm and I began to look at other primate species that I'm watching, and we did a interesting meta analysis looking at the diet of 10 different populations of Japanese macaques across Japan, from the northernmost area in Shimoakita Peninsula down to Yakushima. And that's as an island chain, it's fairly small, but it covers a diversity of different habitats and climates. So that makes for different environments for parasites as well. So what we wanted to do was to look at the potential anti-parasitic properties of the diet and then compare the number of plants with medicinal properties against parasites and the number of parasite species that any one of these 10 populations have. And we did some correlations from there. First of all, just to give you an idea of the overall anti-parasitic properties of the diet of those 10 populations, 12 to 18% of the foods in the diet were classified as medicinal foods. That's from 135 different species and about 1,664 different items that we surveyed overall. 53% of that 12 to 18%, those 53% of the medicinal foods are used by humans to treat gastrointestinal upsets related to parasite infection. They're also used as antibacterials, anthelmintics, antivirals, and have activity demonstrated against ectoparasites as also antifungal properties. And some are very effective against malaria, although Japanese macaques don't have malaria. Such properties are useful across a broad range of different types of infections. So this gives you an idea from the south moving north, the number of parasite species that each of these 10 populations had. And you can see that as you get further north, the number of parasites begins to decrease. So we have a variation in potential parasite pressure on these 10 populations. So we wanted to see how that affects their diet, and in particular, their medicinal food diet. So what we did was to draw a correlation between the number of plants with anti-parasitic properties and the number of parasites species infecting a population. And we found a very nice, strong correlation between those two variables. But when we looked at other medicinal properties not related to parasites, there was no correlation. So there seems to be some kind of pressure on them to select items in their habitat that have an anti-parasitic property. But as we would expect, the majority of things that they eat have no other medicinal or anti-parasitic property. So this is really just a small portion of their diet, but seems to be a very significant part of their diet in relation to parasite load. Parasite species richness, which is the number of parasites that a population is infected by. This is another study. We focused just on the Yakushima population, and we selected a group of plants, again, as medicinal foods, and then collected plant samples and did a collaboration with Denis Tazdemir, based in Europe. And we found from the 45 extracts that we gave her that all were effective against very important parasites such as trypanosoma. Over 80% of those extracts inhibited the growth of Plasmodium falciparum, that's responsible for malaria, and Leishmania donovani. Leishmaniasis is another very significant parasite infecting humans and animals across the tropics. So half of the extracts also displayed antiprotozoal potential against Trypanosoma cruzi, and other extracts were also effective against Schistosoma mansoni, all of these being very important parasite species in tropical countries. Here's a paper, one of the earliest collaborations I did, and this was done in Pisa with Valentina Carai and Professor Borghanini Tarli and Massimo Bardi. He's since left Pisa and was a professor in psychology in the US for quite some time. I think he's returned to Italy now, and it might be based in Bologna. But what we did was look again at the diet of another species, this being the Sifaka in Madagascar. And we found a very interesting relationship between the high concentration of tannins in the diet of the species in general, but a significantly higher amount ingested by females who are pregnant or lactating. Also going to the extent of finding other plants that the rest of the group members don't have, but all high in tannin content. Sifaka diet is fairly small and conservative, but that females would go and select other plants, not that the rest of the group were not eating, that all of these were high in concentration for tannins, created first kind of a puzzle, because if you're a pregnant female, you don't want to take too many tannins because they bind to protein, and you need all the protein you can get to help create that little baby growing inside of you. So there was something, a question that we had as to how this could be going on, why this is happening. So we looked at the literature and found that tannins are frequently used as anti-parasitic agents. So this could be potentially helpful to pregnant female Sifaka who are immune compromised and more susceptible to parasite infections than females who aren't pregnant. And this is the same for human females. And also, they were consuming significantly more tannins also when they were lactating. And tannins are used in dairy production for goats and cows to help females produce more milk. So these two potential functions of tannins, which could potentially be detrimental, seem to be a compromise and have possibly highly adaptive value to females to go out of their way and find more tannins to eat. Another collaboration with a pharmacologist, ethnobotanist in Brazil, we looked at the woolly spider monkey and found that these animals as well within their diet have a small subsection of plants that are also used by local people to treat parasites and a number of other ailments. This is about 24.5% of the diet of this particular population that we looked at. Many more examples. We've looked at elephants, we've looked at porcupines in central Italy, a number of different case studies that all point to the same kind of situation where animals are ingesting a certain part of their, are giving a certain part of their dietary selection to plants that can possibly help control parasite infection. Okay, on to mode 3, therapeutic treatment, and another saying that I like to use, ryoyaku wa kuchi ni nigashi, good medicine is bitter. And I think all of us growing up as kids, mom gives us something that doesn't really taste so good. We don't want to eat it, but she says it'll make us feel better. Things are bitter for a reason, and that's because bitters often have very strong medicinal properties. Again, this first example, bitter pith chewing, this was really the first example of a wild animal species ill and ingesting a plant with known medicinal properties that resulted in the recovery from those symptoms within 24 hours. So this kind of breathed life into earlier studies that were kind of floundering and not being able to move ahead to demonstrate the different aspects of self-medication. And I'll go back to that behavior, leaf swallowing, in just a moment. But bitter pith chewing in chimpanzees involves an interesting relationship between chimpanzees, of course, a widely used medicinal plant by humans all across Africa and other parts of the world where the genus is also found, and a specific parasite species in this population and is found in great apes across Africa that has a very significant impact on the health and can be lethal at times to chimpanzees brought into captivity. So it seems that they have some ways of controlling this parasite, Esophagosimum stephanostomum, in the wild down to subclinical levels at a time when reinfection is at its peak. All of this started from very simple behavioral observations and the ingestion of a plant that we didn't really quite know why it was used, but we knew that it was in their diet for many years. We didn't have anything to suggest that it was anything but food. But part of that problem was because most chimpanzee researchers often would say that chimpanzees in the wild never get sick. They always seem healthy. But the problem with that is that sick chimpanzees don't like to be around other chimpanzees. And so we rarely see sick chimpanzees when we're following a group. But this key set of observations set the pathway for looking at sick behaviors in chimpanzees and also the study of ethnopharmacology and collaborations in parasitology and whatnot. So we were able, with this observation, to demonstrate the recovery from the symptoms seen in the first day and the ingestion of a plant that is widely used by people in the same habitat for very similar symptoms, and their recovery is almost the same 20 to 24-hour period. We followed that up with other observations. In 1991, we published the second paper, and by then we were doing parasitology. We had the phytochemistry of the plant. We had discovered new compounds in the part that the chimpanzees were ingesting, and we were able to make a firmer case that chimpanzees were self-medicating in response to a specific parasite species, and that plant had a significant impact on the parasite load of that species over a very short period of time compared to control individuals. From that early work, 13 new compounds, a whole new class of compounds was discovered by my colleagues at Kyoto University. And those were the vernoniosides, 13 new steroid and glucosides. And this was possible because they looked at a part of the plant that chemists traditionally weren't looking at, because humans weren't using that plant part as medicine. It was the chimpanzees' use of the pith that focused our attention on that part of the plant, and that's where these new compounds came from. From this, a number of different studies, I'll just list two here, some anti-schistosomal activities in the steroid lactones and the steroid glucosides, some anti-tumoral, antimicrobial activities, also from this plant. Work by others afterwards intensified in this plant species and at these on these specific chemical compounds. And now we know a whole wide range of different activities present in this plant. And some have actually moved to patents for the treatment of cancer in humans. Now, back to leaf swallowing behavior. This was an early puzzle in the eyes of Jane Goodall. When she was first starting to watch chimpanzees at Gombe, she would find whole leaves in the feces, but she didn't quite know what was going on. She'd never seen chimpanzees actually fold and swallow them. Richard Wrangham came along for his PhD thesis on feeding ecology. He also noted this behavior. Then he talked to Toshisada Nishida in Mohale and said that I see this behavior. Do your chimps at Mohale do this? And then they started looking at that, and indeed they saw chimpanzees at Mohale doing the same behavior, taking leaves like this that are very rough on the surface, folding and swallowing without chewing, up to 100 leaves, sometimes 25 to 50 leaves per bout, but the biggest number has been 100. And when I started looking more closely at other possible self-medicative behaviors than bitter pith chewing, leaf swallowing was the first obvious place to start looking. So I followed with the intent on tracking the time from when they swallowed the leaves to when the leaves came out, to actually see if there's some kind of chemical properties or anti-parasitic properties. Turns out there was no chemical property to the anti-parasitic impact, but we found again that Esophagosimum staphynostomum, the same parasite targeted by bitter pith chewing, is also targeted by leaf swallowing, and they'll do these two behaviors, practice these two behaviors during the same period of time when reinfection is highest. And basically within 6 to 7 hours, for 2 leaves swallowed, 1 adult parasite, like you can see in this picture here, is expelled. And if you swallow 100 leaves, that's 50 parasites roughly. And that's a significant impact on the parasite load in just one treatment. We've gone on to study this, and I've talked with collaborators around the world, and we found that all of the African great apes have this, and that started a different line of investigation at looking at the parasite host interactions. So taking the observations from the field into the laboratory, began to look more closely at some of these things. And from the parasitological work we did, we found a nice correlation between the timing of the year of the ingestion of medicinal foods and the therapeutic types of behaviors like bitter pith chewing and leaf swallowing. They both overlap during the rainy season at the time when the peak infections of Esophagosimum staphynostomum are happening. And that's what these two figures from 2 different years demonstrate, is that as as we go through into the rainy season, you see the different individuals, AG, BA, MU, TL, whatnot. These are all names of chimpanzees that were followed throughout the year. And we can see that all of their parasite loads of Esophagosimum peak in the rainy season, and then they drop down. If you look really closely, here you'll see FT. And this is an individual that we documented in the second paper that we published on bitter pith chewing. And overnight, the parasite load dropped from 135 down to 15. And that's quite an unusual drop in that short of a period of time compared to all the other individuals in the 2 years here that we've looked at. But basically all of them, their parasite loads drop midway through the rainy season, we think as a result of leaf swallowing and bitter pith chewing. As I mentioned, leaf swallowing is now known to occur all across Africa in lowland eastern and western gorillas, in all the subspecies of chimpanzees, and in multiple populations of bonobos. And what's common in all of these different cases is the leaves that they're selecting are very rough with these spines on the surface that make them hard to digest. And that's one of the plant strategies for anti-herbivory defense that I introduced to you and early on in this talk. And here's a favorite paper of mine that Claudia and I collaborated on. I think she first told me about this behavior at, it was either the Italian Primatological Society meetings in Calci or the Ethological Society
it
meeting.
was there in 2006.
Yeah.
In Pisa.
And she pulled out these leaves and pictures from the back of her car from work that she had done in Thailand. And I was immediately excited. And I said, we've got to write this up. This is so important. And we eventually did that. So this is one of my favorite stories. And it's really interesting because I've collaborated with people studying orangutan in the wild and in captivity for over 20 years now. And we've never seen an orangutan fold and swallow leaves to expel parasites. But here, these clever gibbons are doing what the chimpanzees in Africa are doing. So we can see again that this is a very widespread phenomena that must be very effective. And here the parasite being expelled, Streptophargus pigmentatus, interestingly, is the same parasite that Japanese macaques have. And there are a few examples of Japanese macaques folding and swallowing leaves to expel the same parasite species. So again, very interesting similarities going on in quite different habitats, but due to similar pressures. Collaborations that I've done in Taiwan have also looked at the Chinese lesser civet. This is a small mammal, a carnivorous mammal. They also fold and swallow leaves, and here they're expelling another type of nematode. On to mode 4, the non-ingestive medicinal behavior. And the first examples that came were from the Central and South American primates, mainly the Cebus, Ateles, and Autus group of primates who were taking very strong smelling fruits or leaves of plants, mixing them with saliva, and then rubbing them all over their bodies. And they were proposed to be a form of insect repellent. Other mammals in South and Central America, the coati and the brown bear. The brown bear are also examples in North America, taking plants, chewing on the roots and mixing it with the saliva and rubbing it on their fur to help expel ectoparasites, but also potentially, because of the chemicals that we know are contained in there, also to be effective against skin irritations and to help wound healing. The lemurs in Madagascar are known to use millipedes, an insect that emits this toxic substance when predation attempts are made by birds or whatnot. The lemurs actually bite the millipedes and excite them, and then they exude this toxic substance, and then they'll take that and rub that as well as the millipede itself all over the body. More recent studies have suggested that they're eating these millipedes as well. So it's a two-step process, rubbing on the outside and also ingesting the toxic millipedes that could help control parasites. Birds, of course, are famous for anting, taking ants that emit this acid and letting them crawl over their body to help expel mites and fleas, things like that. Not just putting it on your body, but also where you sleep at night or where you raise your offspring. We have examples from chimpanzees and orangutan of them putting in very strong smelling plants into their nest that help repel parasites. We now know that chimpanzees and orangutans are susceptible to malaria. They carry their own malaria species, and that these plants are effective in expelling some of those mosquitoes, especially when they're sleeping at night and are most vulnerable to mosquito bites. In southern India, the short-nosed fruit bat, which is a fruit-eating bat, of course, by its name, it'll take leaves that it does not ingest as food, chew on it, and then mix it, put it inside of this group of leaves that it clips to fold down and form a tent, and they'll sleep under there during the daytime when they're not out and about looking for fruit. And that substance that they put in their living space is also a repellent for biting insects. The wood rats in North America and the birds of prey will take toxic plants that they don't use as food, and they'll put them in their nests when they're raising their pups or their chicks. So it has an anti-parasitic, antibacterial property. Ants are another interesting example. They're farmers in their termitaria. They raise fungi. That fungi has antibiotic properties. They produce one of the most powerful antibiotics that humans have not yet been able to synthesize. So that kind of behavior has been going on for a very, very long time. And again, this example of the sparrows in Mexico City who are taking the cotton from cigarette butts and lining their nests, they've been able to demonstrate that using controls by removing the cotton filter from half of the study nests. They were able to demonstrate that birds with that in their nest, with the nicotine charged cotton in their nest, their chicks were significantly fatter, significantly fewer parasites, and matured quicker, so that they were able to leave the nest significantly earlier than those that didn't have the benefit of this anti-parasitic, antifungal property in their nest. Coming close to the end now, I don't know if any of you have read the story Dr. Dolittle or seen the movie. It's about this veterinarian who has the amazing powers to talk to animals, and he travels the world talking with animals and learning about what their problems are and trying to help save them. This book was written in the early 1920s, but it's relevant to our discussion here. Is if we could all talk to animals as ethologists, as primatologists, there's so much more that we could learn. But the science, the discipline of ethology is such that we can gain a lot of information by observation. So although they don't speak to us, they speak to us in their motions. And this is a habit that has been with humans throughout our history.
Yes.
And just a few examples that all of you may know about. The invention of coffee, or the discovery of coffee, is said to have been made a long time ago by a goat herder in Ethiopia. Yes. By watching goats eat the green coffee beans. In North American indigenous cultures, the bear is a symbol of medicine. He's called the keeper of medicine in the animal kingdom. And there's a lot of observations from watching the behavior of bears, and from that a number of different compounds and a number of different plants, and the use of compounds within have been widely used in traditional healing and are even available today in herbal shops and things. And also antibiotics, from watching the behavior of animals like is depicted here with the porcupine. This was some observations by the grandfather of my close collaborator in Tanzania, Mohamed Seif Karunde. This is Mohammedi, and the plant we see here in the picture, this is called Mulengelele. It's a member of the acacia family. The roots are highly toxic. The Tongwe knew about this plant for a long time, but they had no use for it because it was just too poisonous to mess around with. But Mohammedi's grandfather, also a traditional healer, was out hunting, and he came across a porcupine in his snare, and he speared it, and he was going to take it home when he realized that little baby porcupines were following behind from the bush. They had lost their mother. They were following the mother. So he took them, he let them follow, and he put them in an enclosure in the village and looked after them. But he noticed that they also fell sick to some kind of ailment. They had bloody stools, which is a symptom very similar to what people in the village were suffering from, and the medications that Babu Karunde had weren't working. So he thought, so he followed these. One of the porcupines escaped, as the story goes, and dug up the roots of the plant and chewed on them. And over the next couple of days, it began to get better.
Sorry Mike, I apologize. Se c'è qualcuno con il microfono aperto, mi raccomando, lo chiuda. I microfoni aperti, per piacere. They cannot hear me.
No problem. So through the observations of Babu Karunde on this sick porcupine, he was able to understand that perhaps this poisonous root could have potential benefit for them as medicine to treat the same kinds of symptoms, bloody stools, which could be a sign of dysentery, for example. So in order to convince the people in the village that they should try this, that they should let him use it, he had to use himself as a guinea pig. So he took a small, a dose that he thought appropriate, drank it in front of the people in the village. He didn't die, so he said, "Come on, let's give this a try." And they accepted that, and people began to recover. The use of that plant spread throughout Western Tanzania amongst the Tongwe tribe. And the last that I heard from Mohammadi before he passed away in 2013, he said that it was being used locally as a substitute for antibiotics not yet available to them for the treatment of secondary infections in AIDS patients. So it all things point to the fact that this has potentially very significant antibiotic properties. Mohammadi would also use this root to treat sexually transmitted diseases. So he's confident as well in the antibacterial properties of this. But that was this medicine was gained by watching the behavior of animals in the wild. This is not an isolated case, however. I wrote a paper in 2020, I believe, that compares some of these traditional legends based on traditional ecological knowledge, or teak, gained by indigenous peoples around the world. There's a number of different examples of animals that are said to be responsible for medicinal knowledge in each different tribe. And there's a number of different examples that I'll give you here. But this interest in traditional views of animal self-medicative behavior has been with us since very early times. Science has been the last to actually come on and take this on board and look at it. But some of the examples from the bear, OSHA, an antiviral, antiseptic, antifungal, and analgesic property in the plant Logisticum porteri, was obtained by the Navajo in southwestern US by watching the behavior of bear. Magic mushrooms, ingestion by bear and caribou or reindeer in Europe and in North America, led to the discovery of a number of different properties in this mushroom. Ayahuasca, a common hallucinogenic plant, is used by jaguar. It's ingested by jaguar, and they show symptoms and behavior much like cats when they come in contact with catnip. But there's also a number of different properties that would seem adaptive to animals in the wild. So humans have learned about this plant again from watching the behavior of jaguars, and use it as a tool for hunting, to expand their awareness and to give them energy or whatnot when hunting. Llama and sloth in Peru, the use of coca enhances endurance, reduces fatigue, pain, relieving, suppresses appetite, an antidepressant and analgesic. Yak in Asia, with the ingestion of caterpillar fungus, has extremely important antiviral, anti-inflammatory, antitoxin, anti-tumor properties, and a number of different things. The examples I just mentioned with mulengalele, two other plants that the Tongwe have learned about from watching the behavior of elephants and wild boar, have antimicrobial, antiparasitic, antidiarrheal, antifebrile activities as well. Interesting observations from gorillas, again from the goats, from Himalayan langurs at high altitudes, and the Tibetan macaque. A number of different examples of traditionally used medicinal plants that have been, whose activity has been demonstrated again in the laboratory, that go back to support these traditional folk tales, and make the connection between the use of animals, the animals' use of medicine, and the local people's use of the same plant. What I did in this paper was to look using the self-medicative paradigms, looking at the different modes and the protocol and the criteria that I lay out for demonstrating whether a plant is self-medicative or not. I went through and looked at these 14 different legends, and I could classify all of them based on the pharmacological and the behavioral information we now have of these species to put them into either mode 2 or mode 3. So we can see examples here from the folk literature that can be tentatively assigned self-medicative properties. So I think this gives us a footing to look further into different species and the diets of different animals to try and find out what's going on with the self-medicative life of all these different species. Oh, I'll skip this. And back to Dr. Doolittle. Animals indeed have a lot to tell us. It's not always what comes out of their mouth, but most often what comes in their mouth and what comes out the other end that tells us about self-medication and gives us an opportunity to expand our knowledge about the world of animal self-medication and how this suite of behaviors have evolved from the insects to primates and ourselves as well. I'll close there by simply stating we stand on the shoulder of giants, large and small. And we have much to gain by looking to them for a view of the way forward for our own medicinal practices, as well as a greater understanding of the role and importance of diet and medicine in the animal kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. This is Monica Carosi speaking.
Hi, Monica.
Thank you for this wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
Is there any question?
Io avrei una domanda, chiedo la traduzione perché mi scuso per l'inglese. Volevo chiedere se, magari non è un'utopia, ma vista la relazione tra quello che si scopre sull'uso dei farmaci naturali degli animali, c'è la speranza o qualche realtà già di finanziamenti a queste ricerche da parte di o università, diciamo, di medicina oppure proprio di industrie farmaceutiche?
Okay. Mike, Roberto was asking if, since the interest in this kind of substances, the interest for the human health could be very high, is there any, as you know, any financial contribution from universities like medicine faculties or pharmaceutical factories that are interested in this kind of research? Is there? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been approached by a couple companies here in Japan and in Germany, but I've been very reluctant because a lot of what I learn about this comes from traditional healers, and the plants that we've looked at in the laboratory. We haven't done this to get patents, so we haven't been interested in financial reward for this. So if we were to go with drug companies, for example, and collaborate with them, we wouldn't be able to publish any of this work for years until they decide that it's no longer profitable to them. So in order to advance the science and increase awareness, we've tried to stay away from those kinds of collaborations. We've gotten some small grants and things to help in different things, and we've had help on certain assays. But as far as taking these products to production to make drugs and things, we haven't gone that route. But companies do seem to be interested in this approach and are looking in other, mainly through pharmacology and going through ethnobotanists to try and find plants that humans use to try and develop the different target drugs. But it's a very expensive and drawn out process, and it inhibits the science behind what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Here is another question in the chat. Jean is asking, she was wondering if the pregnancy FACA females increase the consumption of protein-rich food to compensate for the impact of the tannin.
I don't know. I don't think we looked at it at that question.
Elsa, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mike. It was a really fascinating talk. I hope not to have missed something, but I was wondering at what age does the use of medicinal plants start across the different species and also across the different kind of medicinal plants used according to the different complexity?
Well, we don't have a lot of information about all of the different plants, but with leaf swallowing and bitter pith chewing at Mohali that I've observed directly, the young start at a very early age to copy what their mother's doing. And it's obvious that they really don't quite know what they're copying at first. They'll pick a plant near a plant that mom's eating. Even if it's the right plant, they'll eat a different part, or they'll do something a little bit different. But it's usually around 3 or 4 years of age that chimpanzees anyway begin to demonstrate the behaviors in a similar manner to what their mother would do. But I don't think they understand the medicinal value of that until they actually experience the recovery themselves, if they take it at the right time, which would usually be when they see mom or someone else taking the same plant.
Okay. Thank you very much.
With Japanese macaques, maybe it happens a little bit earlier because they have a quicker developmental stage. They learn about about all the foods that a population eats within the first year and a half of their life. So they're probably exposed to things a little bit quicker, and as they become independent are probably using more things. But we don't know a lot about specific plants used as medicine by Japanese macaques yet. But your question is a very interesting and important one for looking at the development of these behaviors.
Okay, Giulia Pagani.
I have a question. Hello, nice meeting
Hello.
you.
Likewise.
Your seminar is wonderful. I have this question. How much time do you think, what's the lag of time within the animal ingests the plant and realizes that plant has a specific effect? Or how many times does the animal needs to go over the experience to register it as a positive or a negative experience? Are there studies that tell what's the time lag and how many repetitions of the experiences are needed?
No, we don't have that information, but I can tell you how long it takes from ingestion to experience relief. With geophagy, the ingestion of clay, which all animals do at some point in their life, different populations will eat it more or less frequently. That's almost instantaneous because it basically is a very active absorbent of certain toxins, certain plant toxins. So it kind of coats the stomach. The main compounds of that are the same as Pepto-Bismol or bismuth, very, very milky medicines that are used to coat the stomach when it's irritated, if you have heartburn, things like that. And that's almost instantaneous. With the next behavior that we know, leaf swallowing takes 6 hours for the parasites to be expelled. We don't really have a way of knowing how quickly they actually experience relief, but they can see the outcome of that behavior in 6 hours. Bitter pith chewing, we know within 24 hours that they're behaving much, much better. So that's fairly rapid in terms of start to finish using a plant like that.
Okay.
Some of the others we really don't quite know yet, but we haven't been able to look at how many times they need to take it before they realize, this is working, or they realize, this is why everyone else is doing this behavior at this time of year. But I think it has to be from individual experience. But in relation to Elsa's question, they're probably they begin to use it in a methodical manner after 4 or 5 years, meaning that they do it like adults who are fully experienced in this. So it may be a matter of years before they can actually be proficient and effective in using some of these things. But we just don't have a lot of information, so it's hard to
Okay.
give details.
Okay, because I was really curious about it, because some of these plants work, have these compounds that work as anti-herbal to avoid animals to eat them, because they feel, because the animal that eats them feels sick right away. And
Right.
if it feels sick 5 seconds later or 10 minutes later, it won't work, the mechanism. So this lag of time can be really extended in chimpanzees. And I mean, apes do have this ability, but I was wondering if there was any study about this, about the lag of time they need to go over for realize the actual effect, and to develop an active consciousness about
Right.
the medical properties.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure. On that same note, I'm collaborating with some gut-brain neuro enterologists, and one of the ideas that we're trying to look at in more detail is that actual process, how the brain and the gut responds to sickness and responds to certain tastes, to certain compounds. What kind of signal is that sending inside? It's kind of evolved, as you say, and as I introduced in the beginning, to ward off animals. But there also seems to be a mechanism, like I mentioned with the woolly bear caterpillars, that when infected, their preference for tastes change. So healthy animals may avoid bitter tasting things, but sick animals may actually be attracted to those things. And
Right.
that whole mechanism is probably strongly in play from insects to humans. We know in Chinese medicine, for example, a patient that is not feeling well, he's doing this series of treatments. But when he starts complaining about the bitterness of a medicine, it's not because the herbalist has added something, but because the body of the patient no longer requires or wants that. And it perceives it as being unpleasant. So then the healer takes that out of the concoction.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question.
Next question, Fabio Crepaldi, please.
Yeah, can you hear? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you, Michael. It was super fascinating and interesting. And I was wondering if you think it might be worth to distinguish between the reason why an animal is self-medicating. I try to be more clear. So the example that you gave about you taking an aspirin or a primate is that probably they know they are sick. They know what the aspirin or the plant will do. But if I think of like a caterpillar that you mentioned before, that is not a behavior that the caterpillar has learned by observing others. So it's not, I'm not sure, can we say the caterpillar knows, and how the caterpillar knows what it's doing? So maybe, I'm sorry, how can you distinguish between a voluntary gesture from—
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah. From switch, a change in foraging behavior that has this collateral effect of making you feel better. So maybe they need to be treated in different ways.
That's the $1 million question that I think we need to answer eventually, and it all goes back to how much of the response is innate versus learned. Most people tend to think, oh, insects, they it's 100% instinct, but we know that ants and bumblebees teach and learn. So there is some aspects that they learn about where food is from others, which that food source can change from day to day, year to year. So there is learning going on, but even in humans, there's this underlying guidepost of physiological responses, and trying to figure out just how that drives an animal to make the choices that they do. They all obviously need to know when they're not feeling good, because their survival depends on it. But how they respond to things, how that behavior is how that actually works is one of the big questions that we're trying to answer right now. So I'm not making any assumptions. I'm making guesses based on what we know at the moment. But I think even in insects, it's it's a combination of things. We know, for example, that monarch butterfly females will lay their eggs on medicinal plants or non-medicinal plants, depending on their state, if they're infected by parasites or not. So in effect, the offspring, although they never see their mother, the mother never shows them how to self-medicate, they're born on a plant that they'll start to eat. So the sick mother puts their eggs on a plant that is effective against parasites. So when they're born, they're eating those plants. But again, that work hasn't gone beyond that step, so we really don't know how adaptive it is to changes in environments and things. So the monarch butterfly's life history is pretty complex as well. It's not born and dying in the same place, and it's not putting its offspring necessarily in the same place that the offspring will go to when they're adults and they start laying eggs. So it has to be flexible to some extent, or it can be totally hardwired, and it can happen anywhere. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. I think you answered my question. And maybe it might be interesting to look at not self-medicating, but medicating other members of your community.
There's some interesting work happening with that right now. I'm on a thesis committee for a person studying this, and 2 people studying it in different chimpanzee populations.
Yeah, but I think that
others.
As far as I know, it has been already demonstrated in just one species, which is Matabele ant. And so
in ants?
Yeah, it's something that when I never reported the news about the chimpanzee species, I've seen this notion systematically forgotten. So so Matabele, apparently they do medicate other sisters. It's the only species already documented. So yeah.
Oh well, if ants can do it, then heck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we need to close this down. It's too late now. We would love to stay here the whole day, the whole night, talking to you, Mike, really. Thank you again very much for this enlightening and inspiring and motivational kind of talk, not only scientifically speaking, but also human-like. Okay, bye to everybody, and hopefully to see you in Italy soon, Mike.
Yes, thank you. Me too.
You will be very welcome.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Monica.
much.
Bye-bye, Mike.
Bye, ciao.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao, Mike.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.